At 9:17 on the morning of January 22nd, 1943, on the island of Guadalcanal, an American officer lay motionless inside the shattered remains of a Japanese bunker. He had been there since before dawn, not shifting his body, not adjusting his position, barely breathing. Sweat ran down his face and soaked into the dirt beneath him, but he did not wipe it away. Any movement, no matter how small, could cost him his life. His name was John George, second lieutenant, 27 years old. No confirmed kills. Through the scope of his rifle, he watched a banyan tree 240 yards away, a massive tree, older than the war itself, its branches spreading wide across the jungle canopy. For 6 weeks, other officers had laughed at him for watching that tree. They laughed at the rifle he carried. They laughed at the scope mounted on it. They laughed at the idea that a civilian hunting weapon had any place in a modern war. But in the last 72 hours, 14 American soldiers had been killed in this patch of jungle, and the laughter had stopped. John George was not a battlefield legend. He did not have a chest full of medals. He did not have stories that other men gathered around to hear. He did not have the reputation of a killer. What he had was something quieter and far more dangerous. Before the war, George was a competitive marksman. In 1939, he won the Illinois State Shooting Championship, firing 6-inch groups at 600 yards using iron sights. No scope, no assistance, just consistency, breath control, and discipline. He understood wind. He understood patience. He understood that shooting was not about pulling the trigger quickly, it was about knowing exactly when not to. With 2 years of National Guard pay, he bought himself a rifle, a Winchester Model 70. Bolt action, 5 rounds, chambered in 30-06. He paired it with a Lyman Alaskan scope, a rugged optic designed for hunters and explorers, not soldiers. When he first unpacked it, the armorer looked at the rifle and asked a simple question. Is this for deer? George did not argue. He did not explain. He simply replied, it's for the Japanese. The rifle never made the journey with him. While other soldiers cleaned their M1 Garands during the long voyage across the Pacific, George watched with empty hands. His rifle sat in a warehouse in Illinois, delayed by paperwork, distance, and a system that did not see value in a civilian firearm. The Garand was standard issue, semi-automatic, 8 rounds, fast and forgiving. George's Winchester was slower, deliberate, demanding. To many officers, that made it inferior. Captain Morris ordered George to leave the sporting rifle behind. George carried it anyway. 6 weeks later, a supply sergeant handed him a wooden crate marked fragile. Inside was the rifle George had trusted long before the war ever reached him. By the time the rifle arrived, Guadalcanal was already a graveyard. The Marines had landed in August of 1942 and had been fighting without pause ever since. They had secured Henderson Field, the island's strategic heart, but the Japanese still controlled Mount Austin, known to them as the Gifu. 500 defenders, 47 bunkers, interlocking fields of fire. American units attacked again and again. Each attack cost lives. George's battalion alone had lost 34 men killed and 279 wounded. And still, George had not fired his rifle in combat. The jungle around Point Cruz was different. There were no concrete bunkers, no trenches carved into the earth, only jungle. Massive banyan trees rose nearly 90 feet into the air, their trunks thick enough to hide a man completely. Japanese soldiers who had retreated west climbed those trees, hollowed out hides, and turned the canopy into a killing ground. They did not fire repeatedly. They fired once. Then they disappeared. On January 19th, a sniper killed Corporal Davis while he was bent over collecting water. On January 20th, 2 more men were shot dead while moving through the groves. No muzzle flashes, no bodies recovered. Just the crack of a rifle and silence. Fear spread through the unit. That night, the battalion commander summoned John George. He had heard about the rifle, he had heard about the scope, and now, with men dying, he wanted answers. He asked George directly if that mail-order rifle could actually hit anything. George did not exaggerate. He did not promise miracles. He explained his background, his competitions, the distances he had shot, the consistency he had proven. The commander listened carefully. Then he gave George until morning. George spent the night preparing. He cleaned away the last traces of storage grease, checked the scope mounts, verified the rifle's zero, loaded 5 rounds of 30-06 ammunition. He did not sleep. At dawn on January 22nd, George moved forward alone and took position inside the ruins of a Japanese bunker overlooking the coconut groves. Ahead of him stood the banyan trees. This was where the snipers lived. George lay still. The Lyman Alaskan scope offered only 2.5 power magnification. It would not reveal targets for him. It would not solve problems. He would have to see movement. He scanned slowly, left to right, top to bottom, filtering out birds, leaves, wind. At 9:17, he saw it. A branch moved, just slightly. Then a shape appeared, a man in dark clothing, positioned where 3 branches met. George adjusted his scope 2 clicks right for wind. He slowed his breathing. The Winchester's trigger broke cleanly. The Japanese sniper jerked backward and fell, crashing through the branches before hitting the jungle floor. George worked the bolt and chambered another round. Japanese snipers worked in pairs. If one had fired, the other would be nearby. George did not rush. The first sniper was down, but the jungle did not react. No shouting, no movement, no gunfire in return. That silence told him something important. The Japanese sniper had not been alone. George worked the bolt slowly, chambering a fresh round. The metallic sound was soft, controlled, almost lost beneath the noise of insects and distant wind moving through the canopy. He kept the scope trained on the same tree. Japanese snipers worked in pairs. One man fired, the other observed, corrected, and covered the escape. If George had just killed the shooter, the spotter would still be there, watching. At 9:43, George saw movement again. Not a branch this time, a body. The second Japanese sniper was climbing down the trunk, moving cautiously, keeping his body close to the bark. He had heard the shot. He understood what it meant. George tracked the movement through the scope. He did not aim where the man was. He aimed where the man would be. He fired. The second sniper fell backward, losing his grip, tumbling down through the branches before striking the jungle floor. 2 shots, 2 kills. George worked the bolt again and reloaded. His heart rate barely changed. Years of competition shooting had taught him something most soldiers never learned. Adrenaline was the enemy of accuracy. Control mattered more than speed. For nearly 2 hours, nothing happened. George remained in position, scanning the surrounding banyan trees one by one. The low magnification of the Lyman Alaskan forced him to search slowly, methodically. The jungle canopy created deep shadows. Every dark shape could be a man. Every movement could be a trick of the light. At 11:21, the silence broke. A Japanese bullet slammed into the sandbag 6 inches from George's head. Dirt and fibers exploded into his face. George rolled left instantly, pressing himself against the bunker wall. He did not look back. He did not fire blindly. He waited. The shot had come from the southwest. George counted silently. 1 minute, 2 minutes, 3. Then and only then he eased himself back into position. He brought the scope up slowly and began searching the trees again, starting with the direction of the shot. At 11:38, he found him. The third sniper had repositioned to a different branch but had remained in the same tree. That decision cost him his life. George placed the crosshairs on the dark shape and fired. The body slumped forward and disappeared into the foliage below. By noon, George had killed 5 Japanese snipers. The jungle changed after that. The constant, low-level movement George had grown used to vanished. No shifting branches, no climbing shapes, no exposed silhouettes. The Japanese had stopped moving. Word spread quickly through the American battalion. Men who had mocked George's rifle now whispered his name. Some asked if they could come watch him work. George refused every request. More eyes meant more noise. More noise meant death. That afternoon, Captain Morris was waiting when George returned to camp. The laughter was gone from his voice. January 23rd began with rain. Heavy, tropical rain that pounded the jungle canopy and turned the ground into mud. Visibility collapsed. Sound carried poorly. George returned to the bunker and waited. Rain was dangerous. It masked movement. It covered sound. It allowed a sniper to climb into position without being heard. When the rain finally eased, George saw the first sniper of the day. The Japanese soldier had climbed into position during the storm. George recognized the tactic immediately. Smart. He adjusted for distance and fired. The next sniper chose a tree farther away, 290 yards. That choice told George something important. The Japanese were learning. They were increasing distance, changing angles, forcing him to compensate. George adjusted his scope, calculated drop, and fired. The sniper fell. At 9:57, the ground began to shake. Japanese mortars started landing around the bunker. The first rounds fell 40 yards short. The second salvo landed closer. George understood the message. They had triangulated his position. He waited only long enough to confirm the pattern. Then he grabbed his rifle and ran. The third salvo struck the bunker just as George cleared the area. The concrete ruins disintegrated behind him. George relocated 120 yards north, behind a fallen tree, and settled in again. Now the hunt had changed. The Japanese were no longer just sniping American soldiers. They were hunting John George. This was no longer target shooting. This was a duel. That afternoon, George killed his 7th sniper. At 15:41, he killed his 8th. That one had climbed 94 feet into the canopy, higher than any before. After 9 hours in position, Captain Morris sent a runner to bring George back. George reported calmly, 8 confirmed kills, 12 rounds fired. That night, George lay awake in his tent. The rain returned at 3 in the morning. 11 Japanese snipers. 8 were dead. 3 remained. And George knew something important. The 3 who survived were not average soldiers. They were the best. The ones who learned. The ones who adapted. The ones who stayed alive. January 24th began the same way the previous day had ended. Rain. Heavy, suffocating tropical rain that soaked everything: uniforms, weapons, skin. George sat inside his tent long before dawn, listening to the sound of water pounding against canvas and earth. He loaded his Winchester with 5 fresh rounds. By now, he knew the numbers by heart. 11 Japanese snipers had been operating in this sector. 8 were dead. 3 remained. And the men who remained would not repeat the mistakes of the others. They would not stay in the same tree. They would not expose themselves unnecessarily. They would not rush. George understood something critical. The hunt was no longer about who could shoot better. It was about who could think longer. Instead of returning to the fallen tree position, George changed his approach. He used the rain as cover and moved to a new location, a cluster of large rocks that had once supported a Japanese machine gun position. From there, he could observe the same jungle lanes from a completely different angle. If the remaining snipers were watching his old position, they would see nothing. At 8:28, George found the first sign that confirmed his suspicion: a banyan tree. At first, it looked empty, but then he saw it a hide so perfectly constructed, it blended into the bark itself. A Japanese sniper, positioned with absolute discipline, watching the exact area where George had operated the day before. This was not luck. This was planning. George lowered his rifle and scanned wider. That was when he saw the second man. Lower, closer, in a palm tree. The position was sloppy, too exposed, too obvious. George did not fire. The realization came slowly, then all at once. This man was bait. If George shot him, the real sniper, the one in the banyan, would react, turn his head, shift his weight, reveal movement. George decided to accept the challenge. He placed the crosshairs on the decoy sniper, fired. The man collapsed instantly. George did not watch the body fall. The moment the shot broke, he swung the rifle back toward the banyan tree. He waited, and then it happened. A subtle movement. The real sniper turned his head toward the sound of the shot. That was all George needed. He fired again. 2 shots. 2 kills. The jungle erupted. Japanese machine gun fire tore into the rocks where George had been positioned. Bullets shattered stone and sent fragments into the air. George ran. He sprinted east and dropped into a drainage ditch just as the rocks behind him were reduced to rubble. 6 seconds later, the position was unrecognizable. The Japanese were no longer reacting. They were coordinating. George did not stop moving. He crawled out of the ditch, moved north, and slid into a shell crater partially filled with rainwater. The water rose to his chest as he settled in. Cold, still, silent. Somewhere out there, the final sniper was alive. And George knew something else now. The last man would not be in a tree. George waited. Time slowed. The jungle breathed. Then he saw it. movement low to the ground, so slow it barely registered as motion at all. A shape crawling through undergrowth, using vegetation to break its outline. Not climbing, not exposing itself, learning. At 10:03, the Japanese sniper reached the rocks George had abandoned earlier. He stopped there, scanning east toward the area where George should have relocated. George had a clear shot, 38 yards. The man's back was exposed. George hesitated. This could still be bait. Then George saw the second man, another Japanese soldier, lying prone behind a fallen tree trunk. His rifle was aimed directly toward the drainage ditch George had passed through, covering fire. The trap was elegant. Two men, mutual support, crossing fields of fire. George understood immediately. He could not kill both men before they reacted. The Winchester was bolt action. One shot would reveal him. George made a different decision. He slowly lowered himself deeper into the water. The surface closed over his shoulders. Only his eyes and the muzzle of the rifle remained above water. He held the Winchester pointed upward, keeping water out of the action as best he could. And he waited. At 10:13, the Japanese soldier near the rocks stood up. He signaled to his partner. Both men began moving east, advancing slowly, methodically, sweeping the area where George should have been hiding. They passed the crater. Close, too close. George did not move. At 10:31, a Japanese soldier appeared at the edge of the crater and looked down. For a fraction of a second, both men froze. For a brief moment, time stopped. The Japanese soldier stood at the rim of the shell crater, staring down into the rainwater. John George was directly below him, submerged to his chest, rifle held tight, breath controlled. Both men saw each other at the same instant. George did not hesitate. He rose from the water and fired. The shot was deafening at that distance. The Japanese soldier collapsed backward, falling out of view. George worked the bolt while still half submerged, forcing the action through water and mud. He fired again. The second soldier, the one covering the ditch, dropped where he lay. 2 shots, 2 bodies. The last snipers were dead. But the fight was not over. Shouting erupted across the jungle. More Japanese soldiers were moving in. George did not stay to confirm. He grabbed his rifle and ran north. He sprinted through the jungle, slipping in mud, crashing through brush, branches tearing at his uniform. Japanese rifle fire followed him, shots snapping through the foliage behind his head. George ran for nearly 90 seconds before diving into another shell crater. His lungs burned, his legs shook. When the gunfire faded, he checked his rifle. Mud coated the stock, water dripped from the action. He had 2 rounds left, no stripper clips. George waited. Then he moved again, slowly, carefully. At 11:13, he reached the American perimeter. A sentry raised his weapon. George identified himself. The sentry stepped aside and let him through. John George reported to his commanders shortly afterward. 11 Japanese snipers killed. 4 days. The numbers were difficult to believe. Colonel Ferry listened in silence. When George finished, the colonel asked a single question. Could he train other men? George agreed. But he had one condition. He kept his Winchester. In the months that followed, John George trained 40 soldiers, dividing them into 2-man sniper teams, shooter and spotter. They trained in central India. They learned patience, camouflage, movement, discipline. They would fight as part of Merrill's Marauders in Burma. The campaign was brutal. 83 miles through mountainous jungle, extreme heat, constant rain, disease. Men collapsed from exhaustion. Malaria spread rapidly, but the sniper teams worked. By February 9th, George's section had killed 74 Japanese soldiers, 0 friendly casualties. John George fired his Winchester only 3 times in Burma. He never fired it in combat again. By late May, Merrill's Marauders had covered more than 700 miles. The unit was combat ineffective, too many wounded, too many sick. George was evacuated. The war moved on without him. After the war, John George returned home with the rank of lieutenant colonel and 2 Bronze Stars. But what stayed with him was not the medals. It was the lessons. He wrote them down. In 1947, his book was published under the title Shots Fired in Anger, a calm, precise account of what combat really demanded, stripped of myth and exaggeration. No heroics, no glory, just decisions and consequences. John George died on January 3, 2009. His Winchester Model 70 now sits in a display case at the National Firearms Museum. Once mocked as a toy, once dismissed as outdated, it had outperformed expectations. Not because of the weapon, but because of the man who understood how to use it.